This video covers the components of city and state formation. That is, how do groups of humans first start to congregate into what we would call villages and then cities and then into these larger sort of national level state organizations. It's a complex process that happens, it only starts happening about 10,000 years ago, 8,000 years ago, but obviously state formation has a huge impact on the world today. We all live in modern day states. So how these states originally started forming and the various characteristics of state level organizations are important for understanding culture, because it's one of the ways in which human societies can be organized into groups. State level formation and city level formation is dependent on agriculture. You can't have large groups of people gathered together in a single place without the intensive use of agriculture. And agriculture is, again, the cultivation of plant foods that does make intensive use of complex systems. So agriculture is more complex. It's a larger scale than horticulture. They're both having to do with the farming of vegetable foods, but agriculture is something that happens on a very large scale. So a larger labor force is required, meaning you have to have more people involved in agriculture. It also requires more land because you're looking at feeding tens of thousands of people off of the produce that's farmed. Having more land incorporated in an agricultural system, therefore, also typically requires some form of irrigation, which is diverting water from rivers so that you can effectively water a larger chunk of land for farming. Also, terracing is a method of land management that many people have practiced, where you take sloping areas of land and sort of cut artificial steps into the slope to create flat surfaces for farming crops more efficiently. Agriculture also typically requires some type of complex machinery. So things like tractors or plows or draft animals. So here we see a picture of a draft animal, a big ox type creature, pulling a plow. And so the use of these other types of tools, more complex than in horticultural societies, this is an important part of an agricultural system. As agriculture becomes more commonplace, as more and more people are involved in the process of doing agriculture, there seems to be a bit of a feedback loop developing. So, having a large area of farmland where you're producing food requires obviously a lot of people to work that land. But as you have a lot of people who work the land, they also need food. So they, in turn, take from what is being produced by the land. But as they become dependent on those sources of agricultural food, their survivability also goes up. So people are surviving more. They're also having more children. More children means you need more food. So then you keep farming. You farm greater areas of land. You need more people to farm. But then the more people who are farming, the more people who are surviving, the more children they're having. So as agriculture becomes more developed, and as more people become involved in the agricultural system, you see that population numbers also increase. And they increase to the point where it becomes essentially impossible to move away from the agricultural model. So not only are crops dependent on humans to farm them, but humans are dependent on the crops to keep them alive. So once humans start getting into an agricultural system, we really become locked into it, and there's no longer an alternative outside of agriculture. As we've discussed before, there are many parts of the world where agriculture has developed independently, or where plants and animals have been domesticated independently. The first area of domestication was here in the Middle East. About 10,000 BC, we see the first plants and animals being domesticated, things like wheat and barley and sheep and goats. But then other areas of the world had their own times of domestication. So in China, 5,000 BC, rice is being domesticated. In the Mediterranean, we have grapes and olives and cabbage. In Mesoamerica, we have maize or corn, avocados, tomatoes. In North America, gourds, pumpkins, sunflowers. And also then in South America, we've got potatoes, a particularly important crop over here. Also things like llamas and guinea pigs are domesticated here in South America. And in Africa, crops like millet or coffee or yams, these are all independently domesticated at different dates. So we see that there are multiple places in the world where agriculture, where farming has developed independently, meaning that it didn't start in one place and then just spread to all of these other locations in the world. We have independent centers of the innovation of domestication of plants and animals. These crops, though, don't just stay in these very restricted environments where they're first domesticated. They tend to spread. As people in adjacent areas learn about domestication and see other people farming, then farming tends to be adopted by other populations of hunter-gatherers, because farming is a more reliable method of acquiring food than the hunter-gatherer lifestyle. So we see that crops tend to spread out from these centers of domestication into adjacent areas. But one of the things that we need to consider in this spread of agriculture is that geography plays a role in this. So agriculture, farming in general, spreads more easily east to west than it does north to south. And that's because east to west environments tend to have similar climates. So crops that do well here in Eurasia will tend to also do well over to the east and over to the west at the same latitude. The same can't be said of crops like potatoes that were first domesticated here in South America. The climate is very different here in the Andes. Get my cursor back. Here in the Andes, the climate is going to be very different than it is at the far southern edge of South America or the far northern part of North America. So it's harder for crops to spread north to south and much easier for them to spread east to west. And this also has implications for how not only farming spreads, but also sort of larger societal patterns. We see that language has also spread more easily east to west in concert with the spread of agriculture in Eurasia than, for example, we see in North and South America. So geography plays a role in how farming is adopted or not in these various parts of the world. As agriculture does spread, though, we see that it becomes a more productive means of food production. So essentially, it's easier to produce more food on an acre of land if you are farming rather than if you are just hunting and gathering, because hunting and gathering relies on wild food resources, whereas when people are essentially creating their own food, it tends to be more reliable and more abundant. Also, as agriculture spreads, we see that people cluster in villages, and they start to become sedentary. Sedentary meaning that they live settled lives in villages. They're no longer nomadic like hunter-gatherers, but instead they stay in one spot because they want to be near the food. They want to be near their agricultural fields. And furthermore, people become dependent on these produced foods. And we mentioned this before. The longer people are entrained in this agricultural system, the more dependent they will become because population numbers get larger, because people are clustering in villages, but they're also having more children. And the reliable sources of food mean that people are perhaps living longer or surviving better than they might have otherwise. So people become very locked into this particular style of food acquisition. And people really become dependent to the point where it's hard to get out of the agricultural system. So as people cluster to take advantage of farming resources, we start to see other levels of social organization starting to emerge. And we might call these chiefdoms and states. And let's just look quickly at how a chiefdom might develop. So here we have a little map. This is obviously something that I just made up. But let's imagine that in this particular area, we have 4 different villages. Okay, each village has a water supply nearby. These are some mountains. Here's a nice big lake. So each village is pretty much doing its own thing in this particular environment. We might also imagine in each of these villages that there are maybe a couple of hundred people all settled together. You'll recall that hunter-gatherers live in groups called bands. And these bands typically max out at about 100 or 150 people. So if you have a village of several hundred, maybe 3, 4, even 500 people in a single village, that's quite a big expansion from the hunter-gatherer group size. It's not surprising then that when you have several hundred people all living in the same place year-round, interacting with each other on a daily basis, that some form of leadership would eventually emerge. And this would probably be an individual who is maybe a good diplomat, who is good at conflict resolution. Someone would sort of rise to be the leader of those particular groups. And for our purposes, we can refer to those leaders as chiefs. So we can say each village has a chief, denoted here by the letter C. So 1, 2, 3, 4 chiefs in their 4 different villages. Now let's further imagine that as each of these villages are going on doing their own independent things, climate's constantly changing, various resources might become more abundant or might become less abundant. And let's imagine, for example, that this particular river, suddenly something has happened and it's not putting out quite as much water as it used to. If this river is no longer flowing the way it used to, it's going to affect the people who live in this village, who are probably using that river to get certain food resources like maybe fish or fresh water, or maybe they're using this river to irrigate their fields. No matter what the outcome is, it's going to have some sort of effect on these people here. Suddenly they don't have enough resources to take care of everyone who's in that village. So something needs to happen, right? Some sort of change needs to be made in the lives of people living here. They might decide to simply move. Perhaps they move everyone in the village over to this part, adjacent to this other lake, but now they're in very close contact with this village, and these guys might not like them, moving into their territory. They could also go to someone else and ask them for help. Or they could decide, we're tough, we're ready to fight, we could just take over, let's say, this village right here. They're nearby, they've still got lots of resources, we can just take all of their stuff. No matter what happens, they're going to have to be essentially doing some sort of negotiating, whether it's physical aggressive negotiating or some sort of friendly negotiation system. They're going to have to work something out with someone else in this area. So let's imagine that they approach this village here and they say, listen, we're not doing so well up here. We don't have enough resources to feed everyone. And if we keep going like this for a couple years, we're all going to die. So can you help us out? And maybe this second village thinks about it for a little bit and they say, okay, well, we'd be happy to help you out. You're not, your neighbors. So sure, we'll make sure that you all still stay alive. But if we're going to be giving you resources, then we have to have some sort of benefit as well. So perhaps the chief here will strike a deal where, yes, they'll help take care of this other village, but that village then needs to somehow be under his control. So we might imagine that, if these two villages are essentially working together, that this chief will take control of the village that's in trouble. And so now this one guy is in charge of 2 villages. He's got a little bit more power, a little bit more influence over a larger geographic area than he had before. He might then decide, well, since I've already got these 2 villages, I might as well expand my reach a bit further and take over this village. So now we've got 3 villages under the control of a single chief. And while we're at it, let's just go ahead and push it one further step. 1 chief in control of now 4 villages. And these 4 villages together will have several thousand people. So a single chief who is in charge of multiple villages, that's the configuration that we refer to as a chiefdom. Okay, so when we talk about chiefdom level organization, we're referring to one individual, and this is typically a man, who is in charge of multiple farming villages in a larger geographic area. And chiefdoms can range from, a couple hundred people to several thousand, up to, maybe 10,000 people can be involved in a single chiefdom. And this is typically how they arise. Now, chiefdoms, when they get big enough, if a chief keeps pulling more and more villages and more people under his control, a chiefdom can eventually become a state. But if we think just about the chiefdom organization for a moment, we're talking about, a little bit less than 10,000 people under the control of a single individual. Those individuals tend to have, high social status. They're effective leaders. Sometimes this chief status is passed from fathers to sons, but not always. What we see in chiefdoms is that these leaders, or I should say the social status of any individual in a chiefdom, is dependent on their relation to the chief. So for example, a chief's son will have a lot of social status and a lot of wealth and a lot of political power. A chief's cousin will have a little bit less. A chief's cousin's brother-in-law's aunt will have even less social status, going all the way down to people who have no relation to the chief at all. So social status in a chiefdom is sort of a sliding scale, and it all depends on your particular relationship to that chief. As chiefdoms get larger and larger and larger and larger, more than 10,000 people, maybe 20,000 people, 50,000 people, 100,000 people, and then today we're talking about in the number of millions of people. This is what we refer to as a state. Okay, so a state level organization is one in which tens or hundreds of thousands of people are under the control of a single governing body. And there might still be this chief, except in a state level organization, perhaps we'd call him a king or an emperor or a czar or a president even. A state is a form of social and political organization. It's much more complex than a chiefdom, simply because of the number of people who are involved in it. And the governing body of a state is no longer a single individual. It's not just a chief. It's a chief and all of his advisors, or all of the priests who are involved in the religious aspects of life. State-level organization has many more layers because there are simply more people. And so we see in state-level societies that there's a division into classes, into social classes. So it's no longer your relationship to the chief, it's what social class you fit into. And it's simply because there are too many people for everyone to be, either the chief's cousin or not the chief's cousin. Society tends to get sorted into the high class, the rich, the elite, the middle class, the low class, the peasant class. So a big indicator when we're looking at chiefdoms and states is the level of social stratification. And remember, this word stratification just refers to some sort of breaking down society into layers or into groups, where some people have more resources, more political power, more social status, and others have less. Now, there are a number of ways in which anthropologists, and specifically archaeologists, have theorized that chiefdoms and states have developed. And we'll talk about these in just a moment, but quickly I want to call your attention to these two pictures. On the left, we have a picture of a village from Papua New Guinea, and this is a horticultural village, meaning that people are doing small-scale farming, and individuals typically farm just for their own individual families. So each family has its own house and its own chunk of farmland where they produce all of the food that their family needs. On the right, we have the capital of the Aztec Empire, or the Aztec state system. And just by looking at things like architecture, we can tell that there are big differences between horticulture and a chiefdom level organization and state level organization. State level organization, because of the sheer number of people who are involved and the resources that are involved, they can marshal those resources into the production of some very, very big things in both a metaphorical and a literal sense. But this, being able to build a huge temple complex like this would only be possible in state level organization. It's not something that could happen in a chiefdom type environment, because this just doesn't have the same number of people and also collective resources to be able to do that type of architecture. So one of the ways in which chiefdoms and states develop, we know that food production or farming can support larger and larger numbers of populations and also can pack people more closely together. We see that as people cluster into these chiefdoms and state level organization, the division of labor becomes more apparent or more complex. And when we say division of labor, we're referring to the fact that as you get more and more people packed together, people can start having specialized jobs. So some people in state level organization will be the artists, some people will be the builders, some people will be the farmers, some people will be the shepherds. Everyone has a specific job. Whereas in smaller communities and in smaller chiefdoms, every individual is still basically required to do their own individual efforts. So each individual still farms for themselves. Each individual still collects their own water. Each individual still makes their own clothing. There's not one farmer in the group or one clothing maker in the group. So a specialization of labor is something that happens as we get larger and larger populations. And we also see in chiefdoms, and especially in states, that political authority and systems of political authority emerge. So individuals and groups of individuals come together to assert control over the masses. There are lots of different reasons why states may have formed in the past, and this is something that's debated very heavily between archaeologists. One reason why states might develop is because of a need to regulate water and water resources, especially if we're talking about farming communities and agriculture, and knowing that agriculture typically requires some type of irrigation. Here we see a picture of a river system, and you see this river winding through this large sort of flat area. You can imagine that water from this river is being diverted off to the sides to supply water to farmland. So if you're up at the top of the river, where the water is first flowing, you have more than enough water than you need to irrigate all of your farmland. But as more and more people are drawing water off a river, it becomes a little bit more sparse towards the end of the river. So if you're stuck down at the very bottom of the river, you might end up with not enough water to irrigate your fields. So some have suggested that the need to control how much water people use, and also to control things like flood control, what happens when big floods come through. Some have suggested that the need to control water is one of the reasons why states have first developed. Some political authority emerged saying, all right, I will organize this collection of villages or these chiefdoms to ensure that everyone under my control will be equally able to irrigate their fields. So water has always been very important for humans, and control of water would give an individual an immense amount of control over a large population. Others have suggested that trading is what has influenced the development of state-level organizations. So let's imagine, for example, 4 villages, okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, and each one of these villages produces a certain crop. Maybe these guys produce wheat, these guys have cotton, these guys have barley, and these guys over here, what do? Maybe they mine copper, okay? So each one of these villages has something that they produce that the others don't have. But obviously the people who produce wheat, they want what the other guys have. The people who produce cotton, they want what the other guys have as well. So what's the most effective way to trade between these 4 villages? Well, they could establish these trade routes where groups 1 and 2 trade directly with each other, and then groups 1 and 3 trade directly with each other, and then groups 1 and 4 trade directly with each other. Then 2 and 3 trade, 2 and 4 trade, and then 3 and 4 trade. So now we have goods moving throughout this entire system, but it requires a lot of movement on the parts of each individual village. So probably a more efficient way of dealing with this, with the fact that everyone wants what everyone else has, is to establish some place in the middle, right? If you establish basically a trading post in between all of those 4 villages, and so every village just needs to bring in their goods to the center and then leave with the products of the other 3. This is a much easier, much more efficient way of conducting trade. And so perhaps this is how states of trade would end up becoming hubs of human activity. And we might even think of this as, where the big cities develop. It's in those central places where everyone can come from the smaller areas to trade their particular goods. A final theory of state development refers to circumscription, which is basically just the concentration of resources. And it's similar to the chiefdom model that we looked at just a minute ago. Basically that as groups of people or as a chief gains more power, they just continue to exert their reach over larger and larger areas. Because when you have control over people, you have control over the things that they produce. So bringing in a larger number of people over a broader area will increase the number of resources that a person has at their disposal. So you have a larger number of people, which also means that you have a larger number of people who can go to war against anyone who wants to resist. So corralling all of these, large groups under a central authority might be how these early states started to emerge. There are a number of attributes of state-level organizations, and we're going to go through these one by one. But what we'll see is that these attributes of states have occurred not only in the past, but also are still in play today. So even though we'll be looking at examples from the ancient world, we can also consider how we see each of these in a place like the United States. So the examples that we're going to use, we'll look at Mesoamerica here and Mesopotamia in the Middle East over here. Places where some of the earliest state-level organizations have developed, but the things that they did in the past, we're still doing today. So these basic characteristics of state-level organizations remain the same throughout time. The first of these is that a state controls a specific territory. So if you were living in the Aztec Empire thousands of years ago, you knew exactly where you were. You knew if you were in the Aztec Empire or outside of the Aztec Empire. There are specific territories with specific borders. The same was true in the Middle East. So everyone who is in a state-level organization knows that they are in that state-level organization. There's no sort of fuzzy boundaries. And we can see this certainly today in the United States of America. We know exactly where our state ends. When we're talking about the United States, our state ends at the Canadian border in the north and the Mexican border in the south. We have a specific territory. Anyone who's inside those borders is in the United States. Anyone who's outside of those borders is outside of the United States. So being able to control a specific territory is an important first characteristic of state-level organization. Second, states have productive farming economies. And as we said at the beginning of this video, state-level organization, or the accumulation of larger numbers of people, requires agriculture. You can't have 100,000 people, living in relatively close quarters if they're all hunter-gatherers. Farming is a much more productive means of getting food. And so in order to support tens or hundreds of thousands of people, you have to have farming as the backbone of that particular system. As part of that, we obviously need to have some sort of control over water or irrigation. And this is something that can be seen in both Mesoamerica and the Middle East thousands of years ago. The Aztecs were very good at controlling things like irrigation, as were the Egyptians, because irrigation is essential for large-scale farming, and large-scale farming is essential for supporting tens or hundreds of thousands of people. The same is true in the United States today. Although many Americans are not farmers anymore, as little as 100 years ago, about 50% of the American population were farming families. So we have a legacy, we have a history of farming, and we still have a huge amount of farmland in the United States today that supports our very, very large population. States also use some form of tribute or taxation at a central place. And so this means essentially that people who live within the state pay something into the center. They pay money or they pay goods into the central government. Again, this happened in the past and it happens today. We can see that we pay taxes into a central place. We pay money every year into the federal government. We pay income taxes, and we also pay taxes on all the goods that we buy on a daily basis. We pay those taxes into the federal government or the state government or the city when we're talking about New York. And those taxes then are sort of repurposed or rechanneled or redistributed. Our taxes support public programs. Our taxes support emergency services. Our taxes support schools. Our taxes support hospitals. Our taxes support the building of roads. Our taxes support libraries. We pay into the center to support those programs that the government provides. And the same was true in the past. In the Aztec Empire, people paid money into the capital or brought their goods into the capital, and the goods that they brought in would support that ruling political class. It would support, the emperor or the priests or whoever was at that top tier of government, those individuals whose job it was to run the state or run the empire. They didn't do the farming for themselves. Other people paid that produce in a form of taxation. So paying into the center is an important component of supporting state level organization and all of the things that they do. States are also extremely stratified. We're stratified into social classes. And we can make this more specific and say we're stratified into socioeconomic classes, where some people have a lot of wealth and a lot of political power and a lot of social status, and some people have very little. This is certainly true in the United States today, where we have a very, very small portion of the population controlling the majority of the wealth. And then we have a decent-sized-ish, not so much anymore, middle class. And then we have a large sort of base, lower socioeconomic class where the majority of people sit. There's a lot of us. We don't control the wealth. But our work supports those individuals in the higher tiers of that social stratification. Again, the same was true in Mesoamerica in the past. You had those individuals in the elite class, and then you had the peasants, you had the, sort of emerging middle class. Definite, very strong distinctions according to every person's place in society. Same is true in the Middle East. This is a picture of a place in Turkey called Bin Tepe, and what you see, all of these little hills that exist here, these are all burial mounds. These are the burial mounds of individual members of the elite ruling class. Burials tell us an awful lot about societies because these are the types of formations that, while they're not that big, each one is maybe 6 meters across, a couple of meters high. It's not the hugest thing in the world, but it's not something that, your average Joe could afford. This is something that only elite people could afford at the time of death. So we can see that in this particular area, there was an elite class, and everyone else, they were just sort of, buried off to the side in their special poor people cemeteries over here. They didn't get to have this honorific type of burial that the elite class did. States also have public buildings and monumental architecture. I showed you this picture earlier, Temple of the Moon at Tenochtitlan. This is a building that can only be constructed with state-level resources. This would have required a lot of wealth and a lot of manpower to construct. Same with these large ziggurats like this one at Ur. This is not something that you could get out of a village of farmers because it's far too much money, far too much investment of time and energy for a small number of people to produce. Monumental sculpture is also important in state-level societies. These are things that have no real function, like these giant Olmec heads. What is the function of this stone? Its function is to be impressive. Its function is to make anyone who sees it go, wow, the person who, ordered that thing be carved, they must have a lot of power. They must have a lot of wealth in order to make this happen. And the same with these buildings. These are meant to be awe-inspiring. It reminds people who are in the state of exactly how powerful that central government is. It also reminds them of their own individual place in society. And it's also meant to inspire awe and maybe fear in the eyes of people who are not in that particular state. So some dignitary comes from afar, they walk up to this big ziggurat, and they're meant to say, wow, this guy has a lot of power. So these are designed with a very particular purpose in mind. We can see the same thing here in the United States. Think about the White House. The White House is an impressive building, or the Pentagon, an impressively large building. All of the work that's done within these public buildings could happen in a series of, trailers set up in a parking lot, but they don't, because that wouldn't be impressive. Our state-level buildings, our federal buildings, are impressive to look at because they're meant to inspire awe. They're meant to show off, essentially, the power and the resources of the state. So we see the same patterns being repeated thousands of years ago as we have today, where states show off their power not only to people from outside, but also to people on the inside. Finally, states have some type of record-keeping system. And record-keeping is extremely important in state-level organization because of the number of people who are involved in it. On the right, we have a cuneiform tablet, and this is one of the earliest forms of writing. And indeed, the first writing systems developed as a way to keep track of trade in early state-level organization. If you're in a village of a couple hundred people and you're going to trade something with your neighbor, you probably don't need to write it down because you can remember exactly, oh, I traded you 4 cucumbers for 4 yams or whatever it was. But when you're in a state-level organization, you're dealing with thousands of people and thousands of units of produce or animals or gold or anything else. Being able to keep accurate records of all those trade interactions is going to be extremely important, and more than any one individual could remember. So the earliest writing systems were devoted to keeping track of things like taxation and trade. And then this writing was then later co-opted into starting to tell narratives, starting to, create and record stories and histories. So we see the same thing happening in the Middle East as we do in Mesoamerica. Certainly record keeping here in the United States is something, the IRS keeps records on us, the Census Bureau keeps records on us, our federal, state, and city government keeps a lot of records to try to figure out, who we are, where we're going, how much we have, how much we can give. Without that elaborate record keeping, the state level organization would fail because it's a matter of, again, controlling all of those various people and plant and animal and money resources. And without state level organization, we probably would never have these fantastic writing systems, which now we use every day. And it also explains why we don't see elaborated writing systems in very small communities today, communities that aren't incorporated into large state-level organization. So there are many languages in the world that have never been written down simply because population numbers have stayed low enough in those areas. There has never been a need to invent some type of record keeping. So these are the attributes of state-level organization. And again, you can look at any state in the modern world and find examples for all of these characteristics. So over the last 10,000 years, although our societies have continued to change, we know that culture is always changing, the basic ways that humans organize themselves and what they deem to be necessary when they get tens or hundreds of thousands of people together in groups, all of those things have remained basically constant